My name is Matthew Ross. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've been someone people thought they had figured out. Not because they really knew me, but because I didn't interrupt the story they were already telling. I've always been seen as the quiet one, dependable, low maintenance, the kind of person who doesn't cause trouble and doesn't ask for much. In family conversations, I was often described as capable, but somehow lacking urgency, smart, but drifting. And when I finally walked away from a job that was slowly breaking me down, that image hardened into something simpler and more convenient. Lazy. That was the word my parents used when explaining my decision to relatives. Not directly to me, not in a conversation where I could speak for myself, but casually, comfortably, as if my entire experience could be reduced to a single flaw that made everyone else feel at ease. What hurt most wasn't the judgment itself. It was realizing that my story was being told without me, interpreted, summarized, and passed along while I was still trying to understand what had happened to my own life. My story was rewritten without my consent, and once people accepted that version, there was very little curiosity left for the truth. This isn't a dramatic story. There's no explosion, no villain speech, no moment where I storm into a room and finally say everything I've been holding back. That kind of ending might feel satisfying, but it wouldn't be honest. What actually happened was quieter than that, slower, and much more revealing. I'm not telling this story to expose anyone or to paint myself as the victim. My parents believed they were being practical. My relatives believed what they were told, and for a long time, I believed that staying silent was the mature thing to do. I thought if I just kept my head down, the truth would eventually become obvious on its own. It didn't. What you're about to hear is a story about being underestimated, not loudly but casually, about how small assumptions compound over time, about how silence, when misunderstood, becomes a role others expect you to keep playing, and about the moment when you realize that explaining yourself might actually keep you trapped longer than saying nothing at all. This is also a story about quiet dominance, not in the sense of control over others, but control over yourself, about choosing patience over reaction, about observing instead of correcting, about letting people sit with the version of you they created while you quietly outgrow it. There's no revenge here, no public reckoning, just distance, clarity, and a series of decisions made without announcement. Some people only noticed the consequences much later, when the version of me they relied on was no longer available. I'm sharing this now because I know how isolating it feels when the people closest to you misunderstand a chapter of your life and then treat that misunderstanding as your identity. If you've ever stepped away from something toxic and watched others label that survival as failure, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized that the people closest to you might be telling a version of your story that doesn't include your voice at all? For most of my life, I existed in my family as a summary. Not a full sentence, not a question, just a conclusion everyone seemed comfortable repeating. Matthew is the quiet one. Matthew is doing something. Matthew will figure it out eventually. I don't remember when that version of me first solidified, but once it did, it became incredibly efficient. People didn't need to ask how I was doing. They didn't need updates. They didn't need to worry. The story was already written, and it didn't require maintenance. At family gatherings, I was present but rarely central. Conversations flowed around me. Careers were compared. Promotions celebrated. Engagements announced. I listened more than I spoke, partly because that was my nature, and partly because when I did speak, it rarely shifted anything. If I mentioned work stress, it was received as mild complaining. If I mentioned uncertainty, it was reframed as indecision. If I mentioned exhaustion, it was quietly translated into lack of drive. No one said these things outright. That's important. There was no cruelty in tone, no sharpness, just a soft collective agreement about who I was. And because it wasn't hostile, it was hard to challenge without seeming defensive. I worked in corporate operations, process optimization, efficiency modeling, the kind of role where your success is measured by the absence of problems. When things ran smoothly, no one noticed. When things broke, you were already late. It was a job that rewarded silence and punished visibility. And I was good at it. Too good, maybe. I absorbed extra responsibilities without complaint. I stayed late without broadcasting it. I fixed problems before they became meetings. From the outside alone, it looked like stability. From the inside, it felt like erosion. But none of that made it into the family narrative. What made it in was the moment I quit. When I finally stepped away, after months of anxiety, sleep disruption, and a constant low-level sense of dread, I didn't announce it dramatically. I didn't frame it as a moral stand. I told my parents calmly that the environment had become unsustainable, and I needed time to reset and reorient. They nodded. They said they understood. Then later, I found out what they told everyone else. That I'd burned out because I didn't like pressure, that I gave up something stable without a plan, that I was taking time off, said in the same tone people use for extended vacations they don't quite approve of. Lazy wasn't always the word used, but it hovered close enough to be felt. I became a cautionary example without ever being consulted. A reference point. Someone's quiet disappointment. What struck me wasn't anger. It was how natural it all felt to them. This version of me fit too neatly into the role I'd always played. The capable but passive one. The one who wouldn't object. The one who didn't demand to be understood. They weren't rewriting my story out of malice. They were editing it for simplicity. And I let them. At the time, I still believed that clarity would emerge if I stayed calm long enough. Those results would speak. That explanations would feel unnecessary once I got back on track. So I didn't correct anyone. I didn't call family members to clarify. I didn't defend my decision. I told myself I was choosing peace. But there's a difference between peace and erasure, and I hadn't learned it yet. What I didn't realize then was that by staying silent, I was agreeing to a role I no longer fit, a role that required me to stay small, uncertain, and quietly available for interpretation. To them, I was someone drifting. To myself, I was someone recovering. Those two truths couldn't coexist forever. And still at that stage, I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't strategizing. I wasn't withholding information as leverage. I was just observing, slowly becoming aware of the gap between who I was and who I was being described as. That gap didn't hurt all at once. It widened gradually. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. The first time it really registered wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no confrontation that replayed in my head afterward. It was a small moment. So small, in fact, that everyone else would have forgotten it by the end of the day. Everyone except me. It happened during a family dinner a few months after I left my job. Nothing formal. Just a quiet evening, food on the table, the usual rhythm of conversation. I was still adjusting to my new routine then. Slower mornings, longer walks, time to think without a deadline pressing into my chest. Someone asked how work was going. Before I could answer, my mother did. "Oh, Matthew's still figuring things out," she said lightly. "He needed a break. You know how he is." The sentence landed gently, almost kindly. There was even a small smile attached to it, like she was protecting me from having to explain myself. Everyone nodded. The conversation moved on. I sat there, fork paused halfway to my mouth, feeling something shift inside me. Not sharply, not painfully, but unmistakably. It was the first time I realized that my voice had been quietly removed from the room without anyone meaning to do harm. I could have corrected it. I could have said, "Actually, I'm consulting now. I'm rebuilding. I'm doing the work." But the moment passed too quickly, and stopping the flow would have felt excessive, awkward, like I was making a big deal out of nothing. So I said nothing. Later that night, I told myself it didn't matter, that she was simplifying for convenience, that it wasn't worth dissecting one sentence spoken without ill intent. But that sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't just what was said, it was what was assumed, that I didn't want to explain, that I couldn't handle complexity, that my absence from a traditional role meant absence of effort altogether. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared, quietly, casually. A relative joked that I must be enjoying all that free time. Someone else asked if I was back to normal yet, as if stress recovery followed a neat calendar. Another suggested a job opening that paid half of what I'd been making, framed as a favor. Each comment on its own was harmless, well-intentioned even. Together, they formed a pattern. What struck me was how no one seemed curious. No one asked why I left, beyond the surface-level explanation they'd already accepted. No one asked what I was learning or planning or building. They didn't see a transition. They saw a stall. And slowly I understood why. The story they had been told required no updates. I was the one who had stepped off the path. Therefore, I was the one who needed time, correction, and guidance. I remember one particular afternoon, sitting alone with a coffee, replaying that dinner conversation in my head. Not with anger, but with clarity. That was the first small cut, not an insult, not a rejection, a quiet reassignment. From adult peer to dependent narrative. What made it sting wasn't pride, it was an agency. I hadn't been stripped of respect loudly, I'd been gently relocated into a role where my explanations were optional. And the most unsettling part? No one thought they were doing anything wrong. That's when I realized something important. The most damaging stories aren't forced on you. They're the ones people tell you when you're not actively interrupting them. I started noticing how often my silence was interpreted as agreement, how easily my restraint was mistaken for passivity, how quickly people filled in the blanks when I didn't rush to define myself. That night, I wrote a single line in my notebook. If I don't tell my story, someone else always will. At the time, it wasn't a declaration. It was an observation. I still wasn't planning to confront anyone. I wasn't preparing a speech. I wasn't even sure what I wanted people to understand yet. But I had started paying attention. And once you begin noticing small cuts, you stop bleeding unknowingly. Once you notice a pattern, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It just keeps repeating, calmly, consistently, until it feels normal. After that first dinner, nothing changed on the surface. There were no apologies to give, no corrections to make. Life went on exactly as it always had, and that was part of the problem. The assumptions about me didn't escalate. They stabilized. At family gatherings, I was still welcomed, still included, still spoken to kindly. But the way people spoke about me had subtly shifted. My life updates were now handled like placeholders. Matthew's still taking some time. He's being careful. He doesn't want anything too stressful right now. Each sentence sounded reasonable, protective even. And because they weren't overtly dismissive, I found myself justifying them on everyone else's behalf. They mean well. They're just worried. It's easier than explaining everything. That last one became my favorite excuse. Explaining everything felt exhausting. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I could already predict how it would be received, half listened to, simplified, filed under temporary. So I stayed quiet. I told myself silence was maturity. That reaction would look insecure. That confidence didn't need defending. But what I didn't admit to myself yet was this. Staying quiet was also easier than risking being misunderstood again. There's a specific kind of fatigue that comes from correcting people who have already decided who you are. It's not loud exhaustion. It's a slow internal dimming, a sense that every explanation requires emotional labor you don't have the energy to perform. So I opted out. When relatives suggested safe jobs, I thanked them. When someone joked about me enjoying unemployment, I smiled. When my parents summarized my life in vague, diminishing terms, I let it pass. Each time I felt a small internal protest, and then watched myself override it. It's not worth it. They'll understand later. Results will speak. That belief, that results would eventually correct the narrative, became my anchor. I held onto it tightly, even as I ignored the evidence piling up around me. Because the truth was, people weren't waiting for results. They were waiting for consistency, and the role they had assigned me was already consistent enough. I started to notice how easily I was excluded from certain conversations. Not intentionally, but by default. Career advice discussions happened around me, not with me. Financial planning conversations assumed I had less to manage. Future-oriented questions were asked of others first. I was still there, still visible, but functionally peripheral. And the most unsettling part? I was complicit. By not objecting, I was confirming their assumptions. By staying calm, I was reinforcing the idea that I didn't mind. By avoiding correction, I was teaching people how to speak for me. I remember one evening, sitting with my parents as they discussed a relative's promotion. The conversation shifted naturally to ambition, drive, and people who really want more. There was a pause. Then my father said gently, "Everyone moves at their own pace." He looked at me when he said it. It wasn't an insult. It was a classification. In that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. Disrespect doesn't always feel hostile. Sometimes it feels like patience you never asked for. And I kept accepting it, because part of me was still trying to be the good son. The easy one. The one who didn't cause tension by insisting on being seen accurately. I told myself I was choosing harmony, But harmony built on distortion is fragile. It only holds as long as one person keeps shrinking. What I hadn't fully understood yet was that by normalizing these small dismissals, I was training myself to expect less curiosity, less respect, less room to evolve publicly. And once that expectation sets in, it becomes dangerously easy to mistake tolerance for peace. Still, at that stage, I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't even particularly sad. I was adapting. Adapting to being misunderstood, adapting to being underestimated, adapting to a version of myself that was easier for others to manage. And that adaptation felt responsible. Until one day, it didn't. Roles don't get assigned in a single moment. They form gradually, through repetition, until one day you realize you're being treated according to a script you never agreed to read. For me, that script became clear in the months after I left my job. I wasn't just the quiet one anymore. I was the low expectation one. The person whose life was described in generalities because specifics would require effort. The one who could be depended on to stay calm, agreeable, and, most importantly, unchallenging. I was still considered reliable. That part never disappeared. If someone needed help moving, I was asked. If a relative needed something explained carefully, I was called. If there was a problem that required patience instead of urgency, it somehow found its way to me. I was useful, but usefulness isn't the same as being respected. No one asked for my opinion on major decisions anymore. No one asked what I was aiming toward. The assumption was that I didn't need a trajectory, just stability, something manageable, something modest. And because I didn't protest, the role solidified. At one family gathering, an aunt asked what I planned to do eventually. The word lingered between us, heavy with implication. Before I could respond, someone else chimed in. Matthew's good at keeping things running. He doesn't need all that pressure. Everyone nodded again. That nod, so small, so synchronized, was when it finally became undeniable. I wasn't being misunderstood temporarily. I was being placed. The role was clear. Be the calm one. Be the helpful one. Don't demand too much. Don't disrupt the narrative. And in exchange, you'll be accepted without friction. What surprised me most wasn't how easily they agreed on this role, but how easily I'd slipped into performing it. I started downplaying my own progress automatically. I stopped sharing details unless asked directly. I chose language that made me sound uncertain, even when I wasn't. Not because I lacked confidence, but because confidence invited questions. And questions invited explanations. And explanations I had learned rarely changed anything. So I adjusted. I became the version of myself that fit the room. But something about that realization stayed with me. The role I'd been assigned required me to remain unfinished, always in transition, always figuring it out, never arriving anywhere definitive enough to challenge their perception. And that was the part that began to feel suffocating, because quietly, privately, I was changing. I was reading again, studying, rebuilding skills I'd neglected, taking on small consulting work without announcing it, testing ideas, documenting everything. None of that fit the role, so none of it was visible. And that invisibility at first felt safe. No pressure, no expectations, no commentary. But safety has a cost. The more invisible my growth became, the more fixed their perception of me grew. And the more fixed their perception became, the more effort it would eventually take to contradict it. That's when I realized the role wasn't neutral. It was limiting. Not because they were stopping me, but because they had already decided who I wouldn't become. And as long as I stayed within that role, I would never force them to reconsider. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a rebrand. I didn't correct the assumptions. Because somewhere along the way, something else had begun to form. Not resentment, not defiance. Clarity. I started to see that the role they assigned me wasn't about my abilities. It was about their comfort. About having someone who didn't require recalibration. Someone whose story stayed predictable. And I understood then, changing their perception wouldn't happen through explanation. It would only happen through absence. But that understanding was still incomplete, still theoretical. The real shift hadn't happened yet. The shift didn't come during an argument. It didn't arrive after a particularly painful comment or a breaking point everyone could point to later and say, that's when everything changed. It came on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet that no one else witnessed it. I was sitting alone in a public library, one of those older buildings where the light filters in softly and time feels suspended. I'd been there for hours, moving between books, notes spread out beside me, my worn notebook open as usual. I wasn't researching anything dramatic, just patterns, skills, systems, ways people quietly reposition their lives without asking permission. At some point, I took a break and checked my phone. There was a message from my mother. Nothing alarming, just an update. She mentioned running into a relative who asked how I was doing. She said she told them I was still taking it easy and not rushing back into anything. I stared at the message longer than I needed to, not because it upset me, but because it confirmed something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the official version of me now. And in that moment, something inside me disengaged. Not emotionally, not angrily. Strategically. I realized that correcting this narrative wouldn't restore anything. It wouldn't give me my voice back. It would just invite negotiation. Arguments about tone, intent, and overreaction. They weren't misrepresenting me out of malice. They were doing it out of habit. And habits don't break when you explain them. They break when they stop working. I closed my notebook and sat back, letting the realization settle. I had been waiting for permission. Not consciously, but internally. Waiting for the moment when my progress would be enough to justify clarity. Waiting for the version of myself that would make explanations undeniable. But there would never be such a moment. Because the people telling my story weren't waiting to be convinced. They were waiting for continuity. And I'd been supplying it by staying available, predictable, and quietly compliant. That was the day I stopped trying to be understood by them. Not in a resentful way, in a practical one. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I made a simpler decision. I would stop optimizing my behavior for their comfort. That meant a few small but significant changes. I stopped volunteering explanations that weren't asked for. I stopped softening my language to seem less ambitious. I stopped reassuring people that I was okay when what they meant was unchallenging. Most importantly, I stopped expecting them to update their perception of me on their own. Instead, I focused entirely on alignment between who I was becoming and how I lived. That alignment didn't require approval. It required distance. That afternoon in the library, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook, underlined twice. Silence is only a weakness if it's unintentional. Up until then, my silence had been habitual, reflexive, protective. From that day on, it became deliberate. I still attended family events, still answered messages, still showed up when needed, but I stopped performing the role they expected. I didn't contradict them. I didn't correct them. I didn't seek validation. I simply stopped feeding the narrative. And something subtle happened almost immediately. The comments didn't stop, but they lost traction because I wasn't engaging with them anymore. I realized then that power doesn't always come from asserting yourself loudly. Sometimes it comes from withdrawing your emotional labor, from refusing to manage other people's assumptions for them. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt calm, like stepping out of a current that had been carrying me somewhere I didn't intend to go. I didn't know exactly where this new direction would lead yet. I didn't have a final outcome in mind, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again allow my life to be summarized by people who weren't listening. And that quiet decision, made alone, unnoticed, was the beginning of everything that followed. Once silence became intentional, it changed texture. It no longer felt like avoidance. It no longer felt like surrender. It felt like space. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. There was no visible line between the version of me who stayed quiet out of habit and the version who stayed quiet by design. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, everything was. I stopped offering updates unless someone asked directly. And even then, I answered with precision instead of reassurance. I didn't soften my words to manage expectations. I didn't frame my choices in a way that made others comfortable. If someone asked what I was doing, I answered simply, I'm working. If they asked where it was going, I said, I'll know when it's ready. No defensiveness, no over-explaining. That restraint unsettled people more than any argument ever could. Some interpreted it as withdrawal. Others see uncertainty. A few as arrogance, disguised as calm. But most read it the same way they always had. Weakness. I could see it in the way advice became more frequent, more confident. People spoke to me as if I were waiting to be guided, as if I needed reassurance that everything would be okay. You don't want to isolate yourself. Just be careful not to overthink. There's no shame in taking something simple for now. I thanked them. Not because I agreed, but because gratitude cost me nothing and correction cost me momentum. Behind that calm exterior, I was building structure. My days became disciplined, my work became documented, my decisions became slower but firmer. I tracked everything: progress, income, learning curves, missteps. Not for proof, but for clarity, for myself. I realized that the less I spoke about what I was doing, the more accurately I could do it. No premature opinions, no borrowed doubts, no emotional negotiations. And that's when the misinterpretation deepened. People grew more comfortable dismissing me because dismissal requires silence to survive. When you don't protest, people assume agreement. When you don't correct, they assume accuracy. When you don't demand recognition, they assume there's nothing to recognize. I noticed how often conversations ended with a gentle reassurance directed at me, as if I were the fragile one in the room. It'll work out. You'll find your way. You always do things in your own time. Each phrase sounded kind. Each one reinforced the same assumption, that I was behind. I let them believe it, because by then, I understood something crucial. If they underestimated me while I was still visible, they would never notice the moment I stepped out of reach. Silence gave me freedom. Freedom from managing their expectations. Freedom from defending my decisions. Freedom from being evaluated mid-process. What they mistook for passivity was actually refusal. Refusal to participate in conversations that flattened me. Refusal to negotiate my self-worth. Refusal to explain a path that wasn't finished yet. There was a strange relief in being underestimated. No one watched closely. No one tracked my progress. No one anticipated outcomes. And that invisibility, once painful, became strategic. I remember a moment when a relative casually said, "Matthew's just keeping things simple these days." I smiled, because simplicity, when chosen, is power. They couldn't see that my silence wasn't empty. It was full of decisions they weren't entitled to know yet, and for the first time, I felt no urge to correct them, because silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It was something I was using. What people miss when they underestimate you is not your effort. It's your direction. While the narrative about me stayed stagnant, my days became quietly deliberate. There was no rush to prove anything, no timeline I shared with anyone else. The work I was doing didn't look impressive from the outside because it wasn't meant to be seen yet. Most of it happened in ordinary places. Mornings at my desk before the city woke up. Afternoons in libraries, cafes, and co-working spaces. Evenings spent reviewing notes instead of scrolling or distracting myself with noise. I treated my time the way I used to treat corporate systems. Mapping inputs, outputs, dependencies. Except this time, the system was my life. I started by auditing myself. What skills had I relied on without developing further? Which parts of my job had drained me, and which had sharpened me? Where had I been indispensable without being visible? The answers were uncomfortable, but useful. I realized that I had spent years optimizing outcomes for organizations that had no incentive to protect me. I knew how to stabilize chaos, how to make complex processes look effortless, how to absorb responsibility without triggering recognition. That wasn't a weakness. It was leverage I'd never claimed. So I documented it. Every project I'd salvaged, every process I'd redesigned, every problem I'd solved quietly, while others took credit for stability. Not to send anywhere, not to post, just to see it clearly for myself. I also started learning with intention. Not broadly, not impulsively. I focused on adjacent skills that compounded what I already knew. Strategy, independent consulting frameworks, negotiation psychology, and long-term planning. I studied how people transition power without announcing it. How do they reposition themselves without asking for permission? And I tested small things, short-term consulting projects under the radar, advisory conversations that paid in insight more than money, opportunities that didn't look impressive but offered autonomy. Each one was logged, analyzed, improved. No one in my family knew any of this was happening. To them, my life still looked paused, and that was the advantage. There's a particular clarity that comes when no one is watching, when there's no audience to impress and no expectation to fulfill. I made decisions faster, learned from mistakes without shame, pivoted without commentary. I stopped thinking in terms of jobs and started thinking in terms of positions. Where could I place myself so that my strengths weren't invisible, but essential? Where could I work in ways that didn't reward burnout? How could I design leverage instead of chasing approval? These weren't emotional questions, they were structural ones. And the structure is quiet. I remember sitting in a cafe one afternoon, overhearing two people complain loudly about their managers, their workloads, and their lack of autonomy. It felt familiar, comfortably familiar, but instead of resentment, I felt distance. I realized then that the version of me my family described, the drifting, uncertain one, couldn't see this version of me anymore, because I had moved on mentally long before anything changed externally. What they never noticed was how my relationship to time had changed. I wasn't anxious anymore. I wasn't waiting for clarity. I wasn't measuring progress by urgency. I was building something stable enough that it didn't require explanation. And that stability wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It didn't come with sudden success or visible markers. It came with consistency. Day after day, I showed up for myself in ways I never had when I was trying to meet everyone else's expectations. I stopped talking about someday. I stopped justifying my pace. I stopped framing my choices as temporary. Quietly, I had exited the role they assigned me. But from their perspective, nothing had changed. And that was the point. Because when people think they already understand you, they stop paying attention. And when they stop paying attention, you're free to move without interference. By the time anyone noticed that I wasn't available the way I used to be, the foundation was already set. They just didn't know it yet. The reveal wasn't public. There was no announcement, no message sent, no moment where I leaned back and thought, this is it. It happened quietly, the way most real turning points do. I was reviewing my notes late one evening. Months of documentation spread across my desk, projects I'd taken on independently, outcomes I could now trace directly to my decisions, patterns that were no longer theoretical, but proven. For the first time, I wasn't looking at potential. I was looking at leverage, not leverage over people, but over my own trajectory. I could see clearly that I no longer needed to explain gaps in my resume. I didn't need permission to define my work. I didn't need to translate my value into titles that made other people comfortable. I had built something that worked. The realization didn't come with excitement. It came with stillness. Because clarity has weight. I understood then that I had options. Real ones. Options that didn't involve returning to environments that required me to disappear in order to function. Options that didn't rely on approval from people who had already decided who I was allowed to be. And with that understanding came restraint. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't update relatives. I didn't correct the story they were still telling. Because the moment you reveal leverage too early, it stops being leverage. I let the clarity sit with me, tested it, stress tested it, asked myself hard questions. Would this still work if no one acknowledged it? Would I still choose this path if it never impressed anyone? Would I trade this autonomy for familiarity? Each answer came back the same. No. That's when I realized something else. The narrative about me wasn't just inaccurate. It was useful. As long as people believed I was still figuring things out, they expected nothing from me. No explanations, no availability, no emotional labor. And I didn't feel the need to correct that. Because the leverage I discovered didn't need witnesses. It needed discipline. I formalized what I was doing, put structure around it. Legal, financial, operational, everything clean, everything quiet. The more solid it became, the less desire I had to speak about it. Not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the process. I noticed how differently I moved through family spaces then. I listened more. I spoke less. I observed dynamics without inserting myself. When comments about my slow pace came up, they no longer registered emotionally. They sounded like commentary about someone else. Because internally, I had already outgrown the role. The most revealing part of this phase wasn't the progress itself. It was how little it mattered whether anyone else saw it. I had spent so long wanting to be understood that I hadn't realized how powerful it felt to understand myself completely. And with that understanding came a decision. Not yet acted on, but forming. I would not correct the narrative. I would let it expire on its own. Because stories that don't adapt eventually collapse under the weight of reality. And when that happened, I didn't want to be in the room explaining. I wanted to be gone. Once you see your options clearly, indecision stops being confusion. It becomes avoidance. I was at that point now, standing at a quiet intersection with several viable paths in front of me. None of them was dramatic. None of them involved confrontation or public validation. But one of them would permanently change how my life connected to the people who thought they understood it. I could correct the narrative. I could sit my parents down and explain everything. What I'd been building, why I left, and how the assumptions were wrong. I could offer evidence, reassurance, a clean, logical account that would finally place me back into a role they respected. But that path came with a cost. It required me to re-enter the same dynamic that had erased me in the first place, to seek understanding from people who had been comfortable misunderstanding me, to reopen a conversation that centered on their perception instead of my alignment. I could also continue as I was, keep things stable, maintain appearances, let the story drift slowly while I live my life in parallel. No disruption, no tension, just distance growing organically over time. That option felt safe, but safety wasn't the same as integrity, because as long as I stayed available in the same way, I was still participating in the role, even if I no longer believed in it. The third option was the one I hadn't named until then. I could remove myself from the narrative entirely, not by disappearing, not by cutting people off, but by making myself structurally unavailable to be summarized. That meant changing how I showed up, how often, on what terms. It meant no longer filling in the gaps when others spoke for me, no longer offering access to parts of my life that would be flattened or misinterpreted. It meant choosing an action that didn't ask for agreement. That option was irreversible, because once you stop presenting yourself for interpretation, you can't go back to being casually misunderstood. You either accept a distance or force honesty. I sat with that choice for a long time, not emotionally, but methodically. I thought about the version of myself that stayed quiet out of fear of tension, the version that believed harmony required self-erasure, the version that waited for permission to be seen accurately. And I compared it to who I was now, someone grounded, someone clear, someone no longer dependent on being perceived correctly to feel stable. That comparison made the decision obvious. I chose absence. Not physical absence, but narrative absence. I stopped attending certain gatherings, not with excuses, just with boundaries. I declined invitations without explanations. I shortened conversations that drifted toward speculation. I didn't offer updates. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't fill the silence. When people spoke about me inaccurately, I didn't intervene. I let the story run without my participation. This wasn't punishment. It was alignment. I realized that every time I tried to manage how I was seen, I delayed becoming who I already was. The irreversible part wasn't the distance. It was the refusal to be reduced. Once you make that choice, you can't unsee how much of your energy used to go toward maintaining other people's comfort. And you don't want to go back. I didn't know how long it would take for anyone to notice. I didn't know what conclusions they would draw. I just knew that for the first time, my actions and my identity were no longer in conflict. And that was worth whatever misunderstanding followed. Once the decision was made, everything simplified. Not emotionally, but operationally. I stopped thinking in terms of explaining my life and started thinking in terms of structuring it. What needed to be formalized, what needed to be protected, what needed to be irreversible enough that I wouldn't be tempted to slide back into old patterns when things got uncomfortable. I registered the work properly, separated personal and professional finances, set up systems that didn't rely on my constant presence to function. Nothing flashy, nothing impressive to talk about at dinner. Just foundations. I created contracts that defined scope clearly. No ambiguity, no emotional negotiation. I set rates that reflected sustainability, not desperation. I declined projects that felt familiar in the wrong way, the ones that wanted access without accountability. Each decision narrowed my availability, and with every narrowing, my life became quieter. Family communication slowed naturally, not because I stopped responding, but because I stopped over-responding. No long explanations, no emotional cushioning, no updates that invited commentary. How's everything going? Fine. That was it. At first, no one noticed. That's the thing about moving in silence. People only notice absence when they've been relying on your presence. And I had trained everyone to expect very little from me. So the shift registered as nothing. Behind the scenes, though, momentum was building. I was working consistently, predictably, without panic, without urgency-driven mistakes. The work spoke to the people it needed to speak to, clients, collaborators, partners, without passing through my family's interpretation filter. There was something grounding about handling legal documents while being casually underestimated elsewhere, about signing agreements in the morning and hearing, later that week, that I was still keeping things simple. It created a strange duality. Out there, I was positioning myself carefully. In here, I was still considered unfinished. And instead of feeling frustrated, I felt insulated, because expectations shape pressure and pressure shapes behavior. With no one expecting much, I had room to execute properly. I stopped asking myself whether my parents would approve, stopped imagining how I'd explain choices to relatives, stopped rehearsing conversations that would never lead anywhere. I wasn't hiding. I was prioritizing accuracy over visibility. There were moments, quiet ones, when I realized how different my life felt now. Evenings without that low-level anxiety, mornings without dread. Decisions were made because they aligned, not because they looked respectable. And still no one commented. The absence of reaction confirmed something I already knew. They weren't watching closely enough to notice a change until it disrupted something they relied on. So I kept going. I reduced my availability further, choose work that requires deeper focus and longer timelines, made myself less interruptible. The silence around me grew, not empty, but contained. And that was when the first consequences began to form. Not for me. For them, the first sign wasn't a confrontation. It was confusion. Messages started coming in with a different tone. Not urgent, not emotional, just slightly off balance. Questions that they didn't quite know how to ask themselves. Are you around this weekend? Did you see my message from earlier? We haven't caught up in a while. I answered politely, briefly, when it made sense. But I didn't rearrange my life to be available anymore. And that was new. At first, the inconvenience felt minor. Someone else filled in, plans adjusted, nothing dramatic. But over time, small gaps appeared. The relative, who always leaned on me to explain complicated paperwork, had to figure it out alone, or ask someone else who didn't have the patience. The family member who relied on me to stay neutral during tense conversations noticed there was no buffer anymore. The unspoken expectation that I'd quietly show up when things needed stabilizing went unmet. And slowly a subtle discomfort settled in. I heard about it secondhand before anyone said anything to me directly. That's not like Matthew. He's probably busy with his stuff. He used to be easier to reach. Used to. The word mattered because it acknowledged change without understanding it. What they were feeling wasn't abandonment. It was recalibration. The system they'd built around my quiet availability was no longer functioning as expected. And systems don't complain emotionally. They register inefficiency. I noticed how often conversations now include a pause where I used to be. How decisions took longer without someone smoothing the process. How tensions surfaced more quickly without a neutral presence absorbing them. Still, no one asked me why. They asked when. When would I be free? When would I come by? When things would go back to normal. Normal to them meant my quiet person. To me, normal had already changed. The discomfort intensified gradually. Invitations became more specific, less casual. Expectations were stated more clearly, as if clarity could summon compliance. But I didn't react. I didn't defend myself. I didn't justify my absence. I didn't explain my priorities. I simply maintained the boundaries I'd set. And that's when the emotional undercurrent shifted. I could feel it in the way my parents spoke. Careful, slightly strained. In the way relatives framed their concern as curiosity. You seem distant. Everything okay? We just don't see you as much. They weren't accusing. They were unsettled. Because distance challenges narratives. It forces people to notice the gap between who they thought you were and how you're actually behaving. Still, I didn't fill that gap for them. I had learned that once people experience the consequences of an assumption, explanations become unnecessary. They began to feel the loss before understanding its cause. And that's the only order in which real recalibration happens. Not through debate, through absence. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just no longer compensating. The shift from confusion to concern was subtle, but unmistakable. At first, the questions had been casual. Then they became careful. Now they carried weight. It started with my parents. They didn't call to argue. They didn't accuse me of anything. They called the way people do when they sense they're no longer part of a decision-making process they assumed they belonged to. You've been hard to reach lately, my mother said one evening. Not sharply, just searching. I told her I'd been busy. That was true, but it wasn't the answer she was looking for. The conversations that followed had a different rhythm, less certainty, more pauses. They asked how I was doing, but this time they listened a little longer, as if something important might slip through if they didn't. And still, they didn't ask the one question that mattered. They didn't ask what had changed, because asking that would mean acknowledging that something had changed, and that it might not be temporary. Relatives followed the same pattern. Concern replaced advice. Check-ins replaced assumptions. but the underlying expectation remained that whatever distance existed could still be corrected with conversation. What they didn't realize was that the moment for correction had passed quietly, long ago. You can't fix a narrative after someone has stopped participating in it. That's when the anxiety surfaced. Not overt panic, but a sense of scrambling. Attempts to reestablish closeness without addressing the cause of distance. Invitations framed as nostalgia. Stories shared to recreate familiarity. Remember when you used to? We don't see you like we used to. Things feel different. They were right. But different wasn't a phase. It was the result of months, years of accumulation. Of silence misread as consent. Of decisions made on my behalf without my voice. And now the discomfort was spreading because the version of me they relied on wasn't available anymore. They tried to reinsert me gently, asking for help again, looping me into conversations I'd been excluded from, speaking about me with more care, as if tone alone could undo structure. But structure doesn't respond to tone. It responds to boundaries. I noticed how often they referenced the past version of me, as if reminding me of who I used to be might summon him back. The reliable one, the agreeable one, the one who didn't mind. What they hadn't realized was that version of me wasn't resting. He was gone, and not out of anger. Out of clarity, there was a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, when I understood it was too late to fix things the way they wanted to. My mother said, "We just want to make sure you're okay. You don't have to do everything alone." And I believed she meant it, but what she didn't see was that doing things alone was no longer a sign of distress. It was a choice I'd made to protect alignment. Explaining myself now would have required reopening wounds I'd already healed, revisiting dynamics I'd outgrown, shrinking my life back into a shape that fits their comfort. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. They sensed it. That was the hardest part for them. Not that I was distant, but that I was steady. No agitation, no defensiveness, no emotional volatility, just a calm refusal. You can negotiate with anger, you can soothe sadness, but you can't rush clarity. That's when regret entered the room. Unspoken, careful, lingering. They didn't say we misjudged you. They said things like, maybe we should have listened more, or we didn't realize how much you were carrying. They were circling the truth, but circling isn't the same as arriving. And even if they had arrived, the outcome wouldn't have changed. Because the cost of misunderstanding had already been paid. In distance, in trust, in access. And access, once withdrawn intentionally, is not something you casually return. By the time they realized the story they told about me no longer matched reality, reality had moved on. And it wasn't coming back to be corrected. The conversation they'd been circling finally happened on a quiet afternoon. No raised voices, no tension in the room, just a shared awareness that something had shifted and could no longer be ignored. We were sitting at this table, the same one where so many harmless assumptions had been spoken over the years. The setting was familiar enough to feel safe, but the dynamic wasn't. My father spoke first. "You've been different," he said, not accusing, observing. I nodded. There was a pause, the kind that invites correction, explanation, reassurance. I didn't fill it. My mother tried next. "We worry that you're shutting us out." I considered that carefully before responding. "I'm not shutting you out," I said. "I'm just not explaining myself anymore." The words landed quietly. They waited for more. That was the moment where the old version of me would have rushed in, softened it, justified it, reassured them that everything was temporary and fixable. I didn't. "I didn't realize we were making you feel misunderstood," my mother said. I believed her, so I didn't argue. "I know," I replied. That answer surprised them, because it didn't escalate. It didn't assign blame. It didn't invite debate. My father asked, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I looked at him calm. "I did," I said, "just not loudly." That was the closest I came to confrontation. There was silence after that. Not awkward, just heavy with recognition. They were beginning to see that this wasn't about a single misunderstanding or a missed conversation. It was about a pattern that had worked for them, and a pattern I had quietly exited. "We thought we were helping," my mother said. "I know," I replied again, because intention wasn't the issue. Impact was. I didn't list examples. I didn't recount comments. I didn't explain the work I'd been doing or the leverage I'd built. I didn't need to. This wasn't a trial. It was a boundary. "I'm in a good place," I said finally, "but I need to live it without being summarized." They nodded slowly, not because they fully understood, but because they felt the firmness underneath the calm. There was no argument to win here. No apology that would undo time. No explanation that would restore the old closeness. And I wasn't asking for any of that. I wasn't trying to be seen differently. I was insisting on being left alone to be accurate. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. No emotional release, no promises of change, just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and that it wasn't negotiable. As I left, I felt no relief, no sadness either, just alignment. For the first time, my silence and my life were pointing in the same direction. The clearest sign that something has healed isn't joy, it's neutrality. When I look at my life now, I don't feel the urge to defend it. I don't feel the need to frame it carefully or present it in a way that makes sense to anyone else. It simply exists, stable, intentional, and mine. I'm no longer the quiet one by default. I'm quiet by choice. That distinction changed everything. My days are structured around depth instead of urgency. I work with people who value clarity over performance, who don't require constant availability as proof of commitment. I choose projects that align with how I think, not just how they look on paper. And when something doesn't fit, I don't negotiate with myself anymore. I step away. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I carried forward. I used to think distance required resentment to justify it. Those boundaries needed emotional weight to feel legitimate. They don't. Clarity is enough. My relationship with my family didn't end. It changed shape. We speak less but more honestly, not because everything was resolved, but because expectations were finally adjusted. They don't summarize my life anymore, not because they fully understand it, but because they know they don't get to. And that's a kind of respect that doesn't need agreement. I'm no longer trying to be perceived correctly. I'm focused on being positioned correctly in my work, my time, my energy. The difference is subtle but profound. When people ask what I do now, I answer without anticipating their reaction. If they don't understand, I don't translate it down. If they assume something inaccurate, I let it pass unless it matters. Most of the time, it doesn't. I've learned that being underestimated is only painful when you're still seeking permission. Once you're aligned, it becomes irrelevant. What I lost in familiarity, I gained in integrity. I no longer carry the emotional responsibility of correcting narratives that were never curious to begin with. I don't rehearse conversations in my head. I don't wonder how my choices will sound when retold by someone else. That mental space is quiet and productive. The version of me that needed to be understood didn't disappear because he was weak. He disappeared because his job was done. He kept me intact long enough to reach a place where I didn't need him anymore. Now, when I'm silent, it's not because I'm unsure. It's because I'm listening to myself first. And that has made all the difference. There's a moment in every quiet transformation when you realize the conflict is over. Not because it was resolved, but because you no longer belong to it. That's what this story is really about. Not parents who misjudged. Not relatives who repeated an easy narrative. Not even a toxic job that pushed me to leave. It's about what happens when you stop trying to be understood by people who are more comfortable with a simplified version of you. For a long time, I believed clarity came from explanation. If I could just articulate myself well enough, the story would correct itself. But clarity doesn't come from speaking louder. It comes from living in a way that no longer needs permission. My parents told relatives I was lazy after I quit a toxic job. That sentence used to carry weight. It used to echo in my head, quietly shaping how I saw myself. Now it doesn't, not because they took it back, not because everyone suddenly understood the truth, but because I stopped measuring my life against a story I didn't write. The hardest part of this journey wasn't being underestimated. I realized how much energy I spent trying to stay acceptable inside someone else's interpretation of my life. When I withdrew that energy, things didn't explode. They recalibrated. Distance formed. Silence deepened. And in that space, something more stable took shape. An identity that didn't require agreement to exist. There was no dramatic revenge. No moment where I proved anyone wrong in front of an audience. Just a series of quiet decisions that made the old narrative obsolete. And that's the part people don't talk about enough. Sometimes, the most powerful response isn't correction. It's absence. Not disappearing out of spite, but stepping away with clarity. Refusing to perform a role that keeps you small. Letting people sit with the version of you they created, while you live as the version you chose. If there's one moral in all of this, it's simple. You don't owe your full story to people who only listen to the parts that confirm their assumptions. Silence isn't weakness when it's intentional. Distance isn't cruelty when it's aligned. And being misunderstood isn't failure when you're no longer asking for permission to be yourself. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever reached a point where you realized the most honest thing you could do was stop explaining yourself and let your life speak instead? If so, I'd like to hear about it in the comments.